Hello, hello. Welcome back. We are going to be continuing Legends and Lattes. I don't know how I'm feeling today. Um, I might read one chapter. I might not read one chapter. Depends on how long. I might read two. Um, Depends on how far we get, not how I'm feeling. So, um, but yeah, I hope all of you are doing good and life's treating y'all well. Let's get into it. We are on page 104, chapter 12. When Thimble reported for duty, he had much stained scrap of parchment in his paws. He bobbed his way into the shop and slid it onto the countertop, patting it gently. Tandri picked it up to scan. It was a list, written in crabbed and slanting script: flour, soda, cinnamon, dark sugar, salt, and so forth. These are ingredients, she said. The ratkin nodded earnestly, pointing at the parchment. And some supplies? Tandri added as she finished reading. Looks like some pans, bowls. Thimble scurried to investigate the area behind the countertop and peered into the pantry as well, tapping his lip with one claw as he took inventory. He gestured for the paper, and Tandri returned to him with an amused smile. Seizing a stylus from under the counter next to the cash box, he stood on tiptoe to add a few more items to the list before nodding decisively. If Thimble could communicate without speaking, that certainly appeared to be his preference. And this is what you'll need to make more of those rolls? The ones with cinnamon? Asked Viv. Thimble affirmed in the expected way. Any idea where I can get all this? Viv asked Tandri. Not immediately, no. I'm sure you can find a baker, but... Thimble interrupted by pulling on Viv's sleeve and pointing to himself. I shall. I'm sure, well, no time like the present, I guess. Tandri, you're fine with holding things down till we get back? Of course. The ratkin shifted on foot to foot and stared longingly at the coffee machine. Coffee first, he pleaded. Thimble took his time with his drink, clearly appreciating every sip in what had become his favorite booth. The morning rush was in full swing before he finished and carried his mug to the front, where he waited by the door until the last customer in line had ordered. Guess we'll be going, said Viv, drying her hands and joining him. Tandri gave her a distracted nod while frothing milk of a bleary-eyed gate warden. Just as they prepared to leave, Amity drifted across the threshold like a low-lying thunderhead, and Thimble froze without so much as a squeak. Oh, hells, hissed Viv, preparing to hoist the ratkin out of reach at the dyer's cat's slightest aggressive twitch. But Amity only blinked slowly, licked her nose, and then wandered past with a marked disinterest. The beast's visits were so infrequent and unpredictable. Viv hadn't spared a moment's thought for how the cat might regard their baker. Or maybe Viv trusted the stone, and there'd never been a danger from the start. They left the shop, and Viv followed the ratkin as he scampered into the merchant district of the north side. It took the better part of the morning to gather everything Thimble needed, and Viv found herself thoroughly lost on several occasions. When they visited the mill, she bought flour from the same miller she'd rented the cart from. For a few bits extra, he threw in some empty sacks to carry the jumble of bundles, sealed jars, and pieces of crockery remaining on Thimble's list. The ratkin never hesitated, navigating unerringly through a warren of alleys and streets. They visited various shops, and several times he rapped on the door of a private residence. In one notable case, they visited a respectable old man whose house swam with the heady mix of exotic scents. Each time, Thimble tapped his list to request an item of the proprietor, and looked expectantly at Viv until she paid. List conquered, Viv limped awkwardly to the shop, with 2 flour bags over one shoulder, bulging sacks clenched in a fist, and the rest tucked under the opposite arm. Her lower back was complaining again. Thimble marched before her, clutching an armload of wooden spoons. When they arrived, Viv sidled past Hemington and 2 other customers into the back, and unburdened herself with a sigh of relief. Thimble immediately set to unpacking and arranging his prizes in the pantry, struggling gamely under the weight of his flour sacks, but declining any assistance with a sharp shake of his furry head. Viv shrugged and left him to it. Find everything? Asked Tandri. Sure seems to be everything, Viv groaned, cracking her spine. Thimble popped up between them, shocking them both with the longest utterance yet. Enough you're getting on with. Then he returned to his parcels with gusto. After massaging away the worst of her back pain, Viv took over for Tandri as they served the latest round of customers. Behind the two of them, Thimble hummed tunefully to himself. A clatter of pans and bowls and wooden spoons was followed by much measuring and scraping and stirring. He quickly appropriated the small table they'd been using as a drying rack, clambered up on the footstool, and began kneading out his dough. A mist of flour drifted around him as he worked. When the dough rose, he approached with a nervous twitch of whiskers and whispered, "Latte? Thimble, I'll keep a fresh cup in front of you all day if you want." His whole body wriggled with pleasure. Later, after all the customers were served, Viv and Tandri watched curiously as he resumed his work. He smoothed out the dough. With his new pin, spread the thick cinnamon filling across in a glistering layer, and then carefully rolled it into a long cylinder. He sliced it evenly, peeled apart the rolls, and deposited them neatly in a pan. When the dough rose a second time, he lit the stove, threw fistfuls of sugar into a bowl, with butter and milk. He stirred vigorously to make it a glaze. A pleasant yeast and sugar smell pervaded the shop. Once the rolls had risen to his satisfaction, he hopped down to slide them into a side box, then sat on the stool, steepled his fingers, and patiently waited. The scent that arose from the stove now impossible to ignore. "Good gods," murmured Tandri, "that smells amazing. I almost can't stand it." Viv was about to agree, but looked up as she caught motion from the corner of her eye. A carpenter, if the shavings of his hair were anything to go by, swayed in the entryway, his expression foggy. He sniffed hugely, then blinked. He just stood there for a minute, glancing quizzically around the shop and at the menu. "Help you?" asked Viv. He opened his mouth, closed it, and took another deep lungful. "I'll have what it is you have," he said. He took the coffee Tandri brewed, paid dreamily, drifted into the dining area, and sat. He absently sipped this drink while staring off in the distance. Tandri and Viv raised their eyebrows at each other. "Eight hells. What does that smell?" asked a voice they both recognized. Laney approached the counter. "Got a new baker." Viv cocked a thumb and dimple. "Still in the oven, eh? Well, miss, don't mind telling you that I'm relieved. Didn't want to speak ill of the coffee, but bacon is more liable to keep you afloat, and I pride myself on my bacon, so you can trust my judgment." She pressed a modest hand to her bosom. Viv kept her face carefully neutral, thinking of Laney's cake. "Well, won't keep you," continued the old woman. "But when you've come to sell, you set some aside for me here?" "I sure will." As Laney hobbled out the shop, 3 customers entered behind her, and beyond them, Viv could see a passerby slowly glancing around curiously, and then entered the cloud of scent that was pouring out the door. It looked like an afternoon might not be so lean after all, and they hadn't sold a single roll yet. Viv and Tandri held a hurried conference. Viv thought they should charge 2 copper bits per roll, but Tandri laid a hand on her forearm, stared at her seriously, and said, 4 bits, Viv, 4 bits. They took down the menu slate. Tandri quickly added a new entry, in economical strokes of illustration, of a pastry complete with sinus lines representing the incredible smell. Legends and lattes, menu, coffee, exotic aroma and rich full-bodied roast, half bit. Latte, a sophisticated and creamy variation, 1 bit. Cinnamon roll, heavenly frosted cinnamon pastry, 4 bits. Finer taste for the working gent and lady. 4? Viv asked again as she restated the menu on the wall. "Really? Trust me." Thimble hopped off his stool, took up a thick dish towel, cracked open the stove, and withdrew the rolls. They were enormous and golden and beautiful. The smell billowed out in a wave as he placed them on the stove top and closed the door. Viv thought Tandri might have involuntarily moaned, and her own stomach growled noisily. The ratkin drizzled them with the thick, creamy icing that had kept to the side, sniffed experimentally, and nodded in satisfaction. Viv looked up to find Hemington staring with interest at the rolls. "What an incredible smell," he said. "Well, you said you wanted something to eat. You can be first in line." "Ah," said Hemington, looking embarrassed. "Well, you see, I have certain dietary restrictions. I don't really eat bread." Viv's brows drew low, and she leaned heavily on the counter. "I'll just buy you one, though, shall I?" he said lamely. "Thank you. Indeed." At Thimble's nod of encouragement, Tandri transferred the warm rolls onto a platter, one by one, and reverently set them on the counter. As Hemington paid, Viv handed him a roll on a piece of wax paper and leveled a glare at him. "If you don't eat this, it's possible Tandri or I might have to kill you." The young man laughed, although the laugh became strangled when Viv didn't join in. He slunk back into his books with the roll balanced carefully on both palms. Anyone who'd been in the dining area was already in line, waiting their turn, and within 30 minutes, every last roll was gone. Tandri stared at the crumb-strewed plate, ran a finger through a dribble of glaze, licked it off, and looked bleakly at Viv. "I didn't even get to have one," she said. "I would have paid more than 4 bits." "Well, you're in luck," said Viv. "Seems like you'll get another chance. And I don't like to think that what Lainey will do with that broom if we don't remember to set one aside for her too." Thimble was already busily mixing up the new batch, humming again louder and happier than before. That's the end of chapter 12. The shop is really picking up. Let's see. We might do one more chapter. Let me see. Let's do it. Chapter 13, page 113. With Thimble already elbow deep in his baking before dawn, and with Tandri strategically cracking the door ahead of time to let the smell creep into the streets, the opening crowd was easily triple the prior days. Tandri and Viv brewed side by side, working both handles in a flustered but energized confusion, nearly tripping over one another to fill the orders. Thimble's cinnamon rolls disappeared in minutes, but he had wisely already set more dough to rise while the first batch was in the oven, with the stove running full blast. His shop was hotter than usual, and muggy from the steaming rolls, but women sweated through their shirts within the hour. The chatter of the crowd, Thimble's clatter, and the hiss of the rumble of the gnomish coffee machine filled the air with dizzying madness. As the morning crept towards noon, the crowd slackened, but never lapsed for more than 10 minutes. The dining area sang with lively clamor, and the rumble of conversation pervaded. Customers dallied longer, enjoying their baked goods and sipping their drinks without hurrying. And for the first time, more sat at the big communal table than sought the relative solitude of a booth. Viv leaned on the counter, studying their faces, and saw at last what she'd been too nervous to hope for. She found it in half-lit eyes and slow, deliberate swallow, and cupped hands around the warmth of a mug and the lingering enjoyment of the last taste. It was the echo of her own experience, and a pleasant flush of recognition washed over her. "You haven't stopped smiling in an hour," said Tandri, startling Viv out the wood gathering during a brief lull. "I haven't? Nope." They were both red-faced and too warm, but Viv couldn't help but notice how much more relaxed Tandri seemed today. Viv liked it. "Just feels like everything lined up. I had the same feeling a few times before, like when I found black blood." Viv tipped her head towards the blade on the wall. "She just felt at home in my hands, and when I went to use her, well..." Realizing where that story went, she stopped short. "Anyway, this feels right." "It does. Still some kinks to work out, though. I think you can rest your laurels for a day or two," said Tandri with a wry smile. "I don't know. We might boil to death in the meantime." Thimble appeared between them, and they looked down. He glanced up at Viv and tugged at the hem of her shirt, pointing at the oven, then spread his arms wide. Sorry, I don't know what you mean, Thimble." His nose wriggled, and he whispered, "Bigger. Would be better. Bigger. The rolls? They're already as big as my head." He shook his head. Stove. Then he quailed, Sorry. Viv glanced over at the oven. Cal had installed. Thimble had worked non-stop, and the rolls sold out almost as soon as they cooled. Perhaps demand would taper off a little, but she could certainly see how the pace might run the poor ratkin ragged. A bigger stove would make it easier to stay on top of things. "I'd like to, Thimble, but I don't know how we could fit it in here. It's already getting pretty tight back there." Thimble looked downcast for a moment, but he nodded in reluctant agreement. "If only they could keep longer," mused Tandri aloud. "If they didn't have to be fresh, then we could hold them in reserve, take some of the pressure off." The ratkin stared at her, tapped his lower lip thoughtfully with a claw, and blinked a few times. He slowly meandered back to his roll in dough, rolling out a fresh sheet, but Viv noticed that he paused every once in a while to stare into the distance. When Cal dropped by for the first time in days, Viv immediately handed him a cinnamon roll. He examined it curiously, and then took a modest bite. His response was entirely predictable. What was it, good sort of, He nodded at the busy dining area while he chewed and swallowed. Looks as though things are ticking right along. And this, he looked at the roll appreciatively, this mighty fine. Told you that stove might show itself worthy. Don't suppose I could have one of those lattes to go with it. He examined the menu and 6 bits onto the countertop. Viv slid them right back. You keep those, and I've got some more for you if you can think something to do about the heat in here. It's hot as 8 hells when the stove is going. He chewed another bite, closing his eyes with a pleased sigh. Well, I may have a thought, but I might need a piece of time to see it'll work. Something I saw in the gnomish pleasure craft. Very clever. Viv was intrigued. Some kind of window? No, not a window, he said. Don't want to get your hopes up if it ain't workable. You give me a day or two. I'll see what I can see. Try not to burn the place down between now and then. He favored her with one of his thin but genuine smiles. Then he took his drink and his roll and ambled into the dining area. Later in the day, business held steady, with customers trickling in and out often enough to keep them occupied but not harried. As Viv dried her hands for what must have been the 8th time after washing mugs in the basin, a fellow with the look of a farmhand entered the shop. Viv was perplexed to see some kind of loot tucked under one arm. Thick sheaves of yellow hair kept falling over his eyes, and his hands were as enormous and rough as her own, which seemed odd for a musician. Help you? She asked. Hello there. I wanted to hello, he stammered, starting over. My name is Pendry. His voice dropped very low, almost to a whisper. A bard? It sounded more like a question. Congratulations, replied Viv with an amused tone. I was wondering if I could maybe entertain in here, I mean. Viv was taken back. I hadn't really thought about anything like that before, she admitted. That's fine. He nodded hugely as his hair flopping against his cheeks. She couldn't be sure, but she thought it might be relieved. Are you any good? Asked Tandri, coming around the counter and crossing her arms. Viv snorted and nudged. Tandri gently at his ribs. Tell you what, said Viv, thinking of the scalvert stone and the feeling of snapping clothes she's experienced, everything slotting into place. Why don't you go ahead? You're not asking for anything but permission, right? Pendry looked a bit sick to the stomach. Yes, okay. And he just stood there. Tandri made a shooting motion. Go ahead, then. Her expression was severe, but Viv could tell she was trying not to smile. The farmhand, or bard, or whatever he was, shuffled on to the other room, looked around with a barely suppressed horror on his face. He made his way to the back, head down, and turned around slowly. Nobody paid him much attention, and he simply stood there for a few minutes, strangling his lute, fidgeting with the tuning pegs, and murmuring under his breath. Viv was pretty sure he was arguing with himself, and she peered curiously around the corner at him. The lute was odd. She'd never seen one like that before. There didn't seem to be an opening for the front for resonance. Instead, there was a slab of some sort, like slate-like stone underneath it, the strings with silver pins embedded in it. She almost thought she'd fold under his anxiety, slink back out of the shop, but he took a deep breath and began to strum. The noise that emerged was unlike anything she'd expected, and all conversation cut short. There was a raw, wailing edge to the notes, much louder than any lute Viv had ever heard before. She flinched and saw others do the same, as Pendry began playing in earnest. The sound the man produced wasn't unmusical, but there was something almost savage about it. She wondered if maybe her trust in the Scalver stone to draw what she needed here might have been a bit too blind because of this and what it's doing. Viv glanced at the patrons, who looked uncomfortable. A few rose, as though they were prepared to leave. She started to approach the young man, who, for a wonder, looked fully relaxed at this point, lost in the music. As she drew near, his eyes fluttered open, and he saw her. He glanced around the room and absorbed the shocked expressions of the people there, and abruptly stopped playing. Pendry held up a hand. Oh, gods, he moaned, clearly mortified, and he fled the shop, his lute held before him like a shield. Viv felt sorry for the kid, but the afternoon rush put him out of her mind. Demand for baked goods tapered off enough that Thimble could rest, and eventually Viv sent the poor vacuum home. He was knackered, and Viv got the impression that if she didn't cut him off, he'd work himself into unconsciousness. As she returned from clearing tables, she found Tandri standing by the front window. It's not killing again, is it? No, nothing like that. What then? That old man. Viv leaned out the door to look. Seated at one of their tables was an elderly gnome wearing a curious bent cap, like a small sack, and dark spectacles. Before him was a mug, a cinnamon roll, and a chessboard with little ivory pieces on it. Nobody was seated across from him. Curled around the base of the table, however, was Amity, purring in the contented rumble. The huge cat remained an infrequent visitor and shunned the bed of the blankets they'd made, so it was surprised to see her in response. Huh. Amity seems to like him. Viv shrugged. I must be missing something, though. He's been there for an hour. He came in a little after our would-be bard, and I can't figure out who's moving the other pieces. He's playing by himself? Tandri nodded, but he never seems to move for the other side, or at least I've never caught him doing it. You managed to track that out of the corner of your eye? I mean, at first, I didn't pay any attention, but now I can't help but keep glancing over. Well, said Viv, we have Hell's own bard here today. Why not a chess-playing phantom? I'll catch him doing it sometime, Tandri said, nodding decisively. Then two gate wardens crowded through the door to buy out the rest of the rolls. They promptly forgot about the gnome. That is the end of chapter 13, and we are on chapter 14. Wow. Poor bard, though. I really hope they do find a bard. Some live music would be very nice for a place like that. But I'm going to stop it there. And I'd say it's getting pretty interesting. So I want to thank everybody for listening, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you, and have a good rest of your evening, night, morning, whatever it is for you. Goodbye.